Welcome to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning practices in higher ed. I'm Margot Eckenberg.
And I'm Jasmine Pavelka. This podcast is brought to you by Teaching and Learning Services at McGill University. We're recording today from Montreal, Quebec, on unceded land, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We honor their stewardship as we live and work on these lands.
In our first mini-series of this podcast, we talked about how learning can make us feel good and how students' well-being affects their learning. With those ideas in mind, we're back, this time to talk to McGill instructors about how an innovative or creative assessment strategy they use can be adapted to work in different contexts and disciplines, and importantly, work to promote students' learning. So assessment in higher ed is not usually in the headlines, but it is frequently in the news these days, actually, as many people ask themselves what to do about generative AI and assessment. We're not going to delve into the AI question right now because it would eat up all the time we have for the show. But I am bringing it up because as I read more and more about AI and assessment and the answer to the question, what do we do about AI and assessment? I realize that the recommendations are, for the most part, what we want to have happen in the realm of assessment in higher ed anyway. In fact, many people, including many instructors, have been working in these directions for years. Natasha Jankowski, a higher ed consultant with years of experience in assessment, for example, offers the following 4 strategies as an answer to the question, what do we do about AI and assessment? So number 1 on Jankowski's list is increased assessment literacy. That means ensuring that students and instructors have a better understanding of what assessment is and how it can support learning, how it can support student success, and how it can affect instructors' well-being, among other things. Second on the list is to promote transparency. So this means taking away the guesswork. So students are often guessing a lot about how their grades are earned, and transparency helps alleviate that. Number 3 is student involvement and partnerships. So how do we integrate student feedback or even get students involved in the assessment practice, like designing assessments? And fourthly, focusing on a sense of belonging or mattering. So for example, how an assessment task might focus on that focuses on student learning can help students understand why it matters to do it in the first place. In other words, these 4 points don't really talk about how to handle AI in assessment necessarily. They're just fundamentally good assessment practices. So as we consider examples of strategies being used in McGill today, it can be useful to use those ideas, increasing assessment literacy, promoting transparency, involving students, focusing on belonging or mattering as a general framework. But before we get into the strategy brought to us by today's guest, I wanted to ask you what you thought about all this, Jasmine.
I think it's really interesting and important to bring up AI and assessment, even though it's not our focus for this mini-series. There have been these events or disruptions in our history that kind of make us take a step back from certain processes or systems, like assessment in higher ed, and make us realize or even finally acknowledge that there's maybe a better or more sustainable way to do things. The 4 strategies that you just mentioned, while they're offered to address the question about AI and assessment, they actually don't have anything to do with AI, but rather good assessment practices, as you said, Margot. We've had 2 major events in the last 4 years, the disruption of classes by COVID and the emergence of Gen AI that have really highlighted gaps or shortcomings that a lot of assessment practices had or still have. We don't want assessment to be a house of cards. We need it to have resilience to disruption, and getting there actually helps us design assessments that better support student learning. And as you alluded to, Margot, these 2 things are not mutually exclusive. So I feel that this is an interesting point in higher ed history where we're more aware of the things that need to change, and for multiple reasons. And in addition to that, what I find fascinating, the more I learn about effective assessment strategies and talk to more members of the community, is that students really often know what they need, and their needs almost always align with what we would highlight as good teaching or assessment practices. So one of the strategies you mentioned, Margot, student involvement and student partnerships, I think is very important. And finding that middle ground between students and instructors when it comes to assessment will, at the end of the day, ultimately benefit everyone. We want to provide a quality education to students. This really should be at the center of everything in higher ed. So when students voice that something isn't quite right or offer suggestions on how it might be improved for them, I think we really need to listen. I'm really looking forward to speaking to our instructor guests in this mini series. All of the strategies that we'll be highlighting have been carefully selected based on positive feedback from students, on transferability to different contexts, including class size and discipline, and in that they support healthier learning environments, all while maintaining academic rigor, of course. We're really aiming to offer something for all listeners.
Thanks, Jasmine. I couldn't agree more. I think the idea that you bring forward of sort of having pillars or foundation, strong foundation for an assessment culture at a university is just such a, it seems so simple, but it's so important and difficult to achieve really in many ways. But I think we can work towards it. So without further ado, let's get to our guest.
So today we have invited Dr. Laura Pavelka to the show. Welcome, Laura. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, about what and where you teach, and any other projects or activities you're involved with that you might want to share.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So I am a faculty lecturer in the Department of Chemistry at McGill. I started here in 2012. So somehow I'm in my 12th year here at McGill, which still boggles my mind. So I am a teaching faculty member, which means that the majority of my focus is on teaching primarily large courses at the U0, U1 level, as well as projects on pedagogical improvement and student-led learning. So there's 3 faculty lecturers in the Department of Chemistry, as well as several academic associates. And we are also part of what's called the Chemical Education Research Group, which we founded last year in association with the Office of Science Education. So we are working together to promote not just chemistry education, but improved engagement in general for our undergrads.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, and thanks for being here with us today. We're really thrilled to have you on Teach, Learn, Share, and we're excited to hear about your assessment strategy. Can you describe the 2-stage exam that you give your students? And please let our listeners know about the context of your course. So the subject, class size, year of study of students, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So I teach a U1 organic chemistry, part 1 and part 2, so fall, winter semesters. They are about 600 students each. So these are very large classes. And I started running 2-stage midterms in 2019 with a small hiatus during our remote years and reinstated them in 2022. We have developed quite a bit of, flexibility and I don't know if we'll say perfecting it, but we've been modifying them each year to meet student needs and logistical demands, because it is a very large class. So that is always a challenge. So in general, the way it works, we have for the midterms sort of 2 different components. So there's a collaborative component and an individual component. 2-stage exams have been, gaining popularity in recent years over many disciplines. But I was never super excited to try them, mostly because the traditional way to do it is you do the individual exam first, the group exam second, where you sort of redo some of the same questions and discuss some of the questions, which works in a lot of situations. I just never really felt personally comfortable with it because I have a lot of exam anxiety and didn't ever want to discuss an exam afterwards. So the way that we run it in our course is they do the group component first, where there's collaborative sort of conceptual problems, and then the individual exam second.
That's really interesting. And it was actually going to be one of my questions, because I know a little bit about this strategy as you've shared it with me before. Having the individual versus collaborative first or second in the order that they happen. And so I feel like there can be benefits to both.
Absolutely.
And I had assumed, I actually didn't know the sequence that you had it in, but I find that really interesting because I thought it would be individual first and then collaborative second. So students would have to do the exam as a traditional way before they even speak with their peers. So I think that's very interesting.
Can I jump in for a second? I wanted to just ask something as well, Laura. I think, welcome to the show, by the way. We're really pleased to have you here. I wanted to ask if students think of that first stage of the exam as preparation for an individual exam, or do they really conceive of the idea of taking an exam collaboratively? Or do they say, oh, well, this is kind of like forcing us into group work to prepare? Just a little curious about student reactions to your strategy.
So I think the reactions have been very widespread. Over the years, we've also migrated to be having more group work sort of weekly in class. And so they're working with the same groups more now in our kind of current iteration. So they're a lot more comfortable working in those groups. And yes, a lot of them approach it as a preparatory stage. I mean, it has different questions than the individual exam, but same concepts, right? Obviously, I don't give them the same questions in their individual exam. It doesn't really work that way when you do the collaborative first. But some of them really do also approach it as like a pre-test, not just a prep, but a pre-test. And a lot of them also utilize it as a like hashing out misconceptions. So I usually try and design the group exam to be much broader and more challenging than I would make the individual exam. So even the high performing students have to think about things a little bit and really work collaboratively to make the solutions.
And so when they submit, do they submit one copy of the exam when they're working collaboratively? Have you ever had situations where students had disputes over an answer to a question? Has that ever been an issue?
It's not been an issue to the point of, I don't know, arguments with me, for example, in terms of what their grades should be or anything like that. The way that we usually do it, I think kind of alleviates that a little bit, because I do give them multiple booklets. Some of them are draft booklets so that at least everyone can see a copy of the exam. I don't necessarily give one per person, but we at least have it. Every 2 people can have a copy. And they're designed as inclusive assessments. So what would be traditionally a 30-minute 2-question exam, they have 80 minutes to complete. And so there's enough time for them to really work it out amongst themselves as well, which I think is really important. I don't want them to have to rush through it and like fight over answers. And so I think that's also been a really helpful component to the group exams, making them that inclusive design.
And are they closed book?
They are closed book.
Why did you decide to do this assessment strategy in your course? Did you have certain goals in mind or something that you felt needed to change?
The main thing in a large enrollment, not limited to large enrollment, but for a lot of STEM courses, is it's very individual assignment and work-based. There's not a lot of opportunity for collaboration. I mean, I think as many people know, science is based on collaboration and discussion. So even before I brought in the 2-stage exam, we'd been working towards having more discussion and group activities in class. And this seemed like a natural progression to then bring that learning objective or style into the assessment as well, to really promote to the students that this matters through all of our course. The other component is that exam anxiety is a terrible problem, not just at McGill, but across higher learning. And so one of the main objectives of 2-stage exams in general is to reduce exam anxiety. And this has been shown in lots of research papers, and in our own feedback results, we do see that improvement. And as I mentioned earlier, I have my own anxiety about a lot of things, including as a student writing exams. So I really feel for them. That writing a 100 question multiple choice exam is incredibly stressful. Not that, I mean, that fits for a lot of situations, but it didn't fit well for our course. And so sort of both components really were my driving force, the collaborative side and the exam anxiety.
Which is why you chose that sequence. That makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Yeah, because I'd imagine students are probably given a lot more confidence when they're able to discuss with their peers and whatnot. That's great. Very cool.
At least that's the hope.
Yeah.
Laura, you've already spoken a little bit to some of the elements of the strategy. Can you walk us through it a little bit, sort of in order, sort of in terms of how the groups are formed? And then you made reference to some draft booklets. I mean, if I were a student in your class, what would be the steps in the implementation of this particular 2-stage exam strategy?
Okay, sure thing. So currently, because the class works in groups once a week, we have them form their own groups. I'm all for that, student-led autonomy. So they form their own groups. We do have a sign up Excel sheet where they can just have a record of what those groups are. In the first iteration of the 2-stage, I did let them make their own groups, but did it in a much more micromanaging kind of way. And it was incredibly challenging when you have many hundreds of students. So I really let that go because it didn't make sense anymore. And then those students that had trouble finding teammates, I did pair up with each other and help them find groups. So it's an optional component. So students are welcome to, not do the group stage exam. We have about 2% of the students that don't do it. It's very small. Everyone seems to be encouraged and excited to do it.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's it blew me away, honestly. But they're comfortable working in those groups now. And I think they really appreciate that it's a help and a bonus towards their exam grade. So they form their own groups. They sign up on an Excel sheet, and we do it during class time. So I do 2 separate classes. It's like midterm week kind of thing. The first class being the 2-stage group component, and then the second class being the individual component. We do this in Leacock 132, so our big classroom. We also have a second classroom upstairs as our overflow classroom. So we also use the Senate room, so we can spread them out a little bit, but it's loud and it's great. So they, self-assemble, we pass out the papers. There's one paper that is the hand-in paper that's very obvious because we do this with CrowdMark. So it has the QR codes printed on it. They know that's the one that gets handed in. There's a colored booklet that's our draft booklet. So they can really tell them apart, yellow or blue or something, so that it's not mistaken for the CrowdMark booklet. And it also usually has, data pages or charts, information, other things that I would give them during an exam. Because this is a chemistry course, we have lots of, sort of given data pages. So they get both of those things. Yeah, they're free to work in their groups for however long it's needed. And we have taken some photos and videos of it, and it is amazing because the atmosphere in the room is just happy, which is crazy when you think of, it should be if they're working together, but in an exam, usually you can feel the anxiety in the room, even as an instructor, or maybe I'm just really in tune to that, but it's really energizing and it's really engaging. The group exam day is one of my favorite days of the year. And I think the students really take advantage of it. The group exam is worth 20% of their midterm grade, with the caveat that it only helps. If it helps, it counts. If it doesn't help, it doesn't count. So there's really no downside. And so that's where they have nothing to lose. So they might as well give it their all. And we see that in a lot of the feedback, that it is really collaborative. We ask them questions about, are you working together, or is one person sort of doing all the work for you? And those are anonymous sort of feedback surveys. And the results are quite positive about really working collaboratively, which is the goal. And so that's wonderful. But yeah, that's kind of how it works.
That sounds great. And I would agree. Usually exam halls the tension is palpable.
Mm-hmm.
And we've, on another episode of this show, speaking to students, they themselves talk about, everyone just looks exhausted, feels anxious. Everyone's wearing sweatpants. Just the whole, I think, and so the fact that can become an exam situation can become something completely different, can be collaborative, can be learning based, can even be fun for students. It's just great to hear. I'm sure the instructions to this are very clear, and we won't go into all the details, but I was curious about whether or not the way the grades are earned is shared with students ahead of time, or is it just sort of the weight of what the midterm is going to be on the or not be on the collaborative component and the individual component on the overall weighting of the course? Or do students get, for example, more detail about how the assessment, the task is actually going to be assessed?
So I don't know how much information they get ahead of time about how it's assessed, but they do know that it'll be like 2 questions, that each question is worth 10 points. I always grade the group exams myself because I feel like that's an important tool, and I try and return it very quickly. Now that we do them on 2 different class days, I do try and return it before our individual exam. So they have their feedback before writing their individual exam, which I couldn't do before when it was like the same day or they were back to back. I feel like that was a really added bonus this year. And they know that. They know that I'm the one that's grading it for them. The TAs do grade the individual exams and have a much more detailed rubric. They see a lot of practice exams ahead of time, so they have a pretty good idea of the styles of questions and the types of answers to those styles of questions, but the questions are new each time. So that's about as much information as they have going into the exam.
Laura, you talked a little bit about some of the benefits already that you've seen for you and your students. You talked about, the atmosphere of the collaborative portion being very happy and upbeat, which is completely the opposite of a traditional exam room. I can attest to that. Yeah. And I also feel like there's something interesting with allowing students the flexibility to make their own groups and having those same groups carried out through the term. Like I imagine students make connections with others, their peers, and those connections probably carry into other classes, into study groups and so on. But have you seen any other benefits? Have you seen a change in students' quality of work?
So we've definitely seen some increases in the grades, which doesn't necessarily always tell the story, the full story, but we've also been kind of changing more variables than not each time because they're based on student feedback. We sort of are altering things to make it as smooth as possible and as student friendly while still maintaining our high academic goals. So it's also hard to compare year over year, like in detail. But it does seem that the students are definitely much more engaged with the content, more confident in discussing that content with each other and with our instruction team. We get a lot more students coming and asking us questions. We get a lot more engagement at office hours, during the tutorials when they're working in groups. I mean, I have all my undergrad mentors and all my TAs there, and it's hard to keep up, and it's amazing. I love it when they ask questions. So I feel like a lot of the group work has really given them some confidence in just approaching new ideas and asking questions. And I feel like that is what science is. So that's a real benefit that I didn't necessarily anticipate, but I'm really pleased to see as well.
And I can absolutely appreciate those types of benefits in such a large class. Like that's very hard to achieve in a large first year science course. So that's awesome. You talked about due to student feedback or maybe things not going as well as you hoped in certain instances about adjusting the process. And so I'm wondering on the flip side, what challenges you may have had over the years and how did you overcome them? So what are some of those process changes that you experienced?
Absolutely. So in the first year we did this, we had the group exam and the individual exam within the same 3-hour block. It was during an evening midterm slot, like sort of a traditional slot. We were spread across, 8 or 10 different rooms on campus, which is kind of our traditional room assignment for an evening midterm of 500 to 600 students. And I found that incredibly challenging because we had TAs invigilating all these different rooms who had never been part of a collaborative exam. They had no idea what I was talking about, even though I tried to give them very clear instruction about how to supervise a collaborative exam. And so I was running like chicken with the head cut off all over campus, like trying to put out fires. And so that wasn't fun. So when we came back after the remote years to doing in-person exams again, I really wanted to do it during class time. So everyone was in the same space, partially for selfish reasons, so that I could be there and not split into, 8 different persons, but also so that it was a much more consistent environment for the students, because that was one of the initial complaints, right? Like, oh, in this room, they had this much time, and in this room, we didn't finish. And there's like all this sort of like inequalities that came up between the different exam rooms that I didn't want. Obviously, that's not the point. So yeah, moving it to in-class time was a huge improvement. And I would never change. Not that I would never, but like, I'm really pleased with that change to overcome that challenge. And using CrowdMark, now that it has an ability to match several students to an invigilated assessment, it's very easy to coordinate grades. The first year we were using CrowdMark, but they didn't have that feature yet. So I had to sort of like manually assign 2 or 3 extra students to each exam grade. And maybe somebody with a bit more computer savvy than myself would have done that better. But having appropriate technology for that really made it much more feasible. And including the group tutorials was another way to overcome some of the challenges, because the first year we did this, where the only times they were formally working in groups were for the exams, it was a bit awkward, I gotta say, because they had not really worked with those groups in a, not necessarily high stakes, but in any kind of stakes environment in the rest of the course. So there was, just that little bit of awkwardness, not necessarily knowing the group dynamic very well. And so there was some time wasted based on that component. So I feel like the last year last year and a half, where they've also been working in those groups regularly, there's a much more increased comfort level for them discussing with each other. They're not necessarily as shy about expressing their opinions or debating an answer with somebody. The confidence level, like I had said before, is a little bit higher. So yeah, moving to class time, having some of the consistent group work alongside and using some technology that made my life simpler, we're all, especially at this scale, much improved.
I really appreciate how you walked us through those different moments of this strategy as well, Laura, in terms of the different iterations, because I think it's comforting to know, and it's true, that assessments often don't work the first time or don't work the way we had planned or hoped, and they do need sort of tweaking and changing. And as you say, you have to speak to some constraints that are logistical or infrastructure in terms of classrooms, and sometimes you have to deal with manage with the technology that you do have. And so these can potentially be seen as roadblocks, but there's also ways to get around them. And so we really appreciate your experience. And I think in a way you've anticipated the next question, which is, what advice would you give? Because by talking about the elements that have helped you to be able to manage it more in terms of technology, and also doing the exam in class, and the collaborative exam in class and in person on the same day, same space. Those are really important, I think, to share with colleagues. Is there anything else another piece of advice that you would give to a colleague who wanted to introduce a 2-stage exam in their course?
So I think the best advice is to, if possible, try it on a smaller scale. I know that's not always possible. I have the advantage of also teaching in the summer session. And so the very, very first time I did a collaborative exam, 2-stage exam, was with my summer class. So it gave me a little bit of confidence to try it with the big class, because it was only about 60 students. I mean, the scale from 60 to 600 is a big jump, but at least it gave me some confidence that it worked for the subject matter. So if that is an opportunity, I know it's not for everyone, that was really comforting for me. I would definitely recommend that they let students form their own groups. We have tried both in the past, and I mean, there's not a huge amount of difference in the outcomes, but I think if you're trying to design a really student-led assessment strategy, giving them that power is respectful. And those that need help, I'm happy to help. So I would recommend staying with that. And if you have quizzes, it might be a good thing to bring in as a quiz component before a midterm component. So before we did the 2-stage midterms, we did have collaborative quizzes during class time, which was like not really formally in groups, but the students could work with each other and ask each other questions, as again, like a micro step towards this collaborative assessment style. So there's like little steps that you can take to see if it works for your content. And if you can take those small steps, I think it helps gain confidence before you just like do it as a midterm or do it for 300 or 400 students, which can be very overwhelming. But that said, if anyone wants to do that, I'm happy to talk to them.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's probably a pretty overwhelming or intimidating endeavor to jump right into a 600 student course and do it for the final. But I do appreciate the idea, and Margot kind of said the same thing of like assessment. Trying new things doesn't have to be perfect to try them. And I think sometimes instructors are a little bit intimidated to try something because they don't want it to not work, or they're afraid it won't go perfectly. But it's true that you can adapt, and it's great to get your feet wet. And
it's not going to go perfectly. I still feel like it's not going perfectly, but I think it's better than before. And I feel like there's such a emphasis on perfection and, the best way. And I'm a big fan of better. So I think it keeps getting better each year, and the students hopefully follow along with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's important. I really like that, going into it thinking this is not going to go perfectly, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. That's a really good piece of advice. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't talked about?
One thing that I will say is my initial confidence to try this type of assessment did come from my experience with the Salties S4 chemistry group. And I know that they don't have communities for every subject matter, but they were an incredible supportive resource. And I had heard about some of the CJEP teachers and Mac Campus instructors doing 2-stage exams in their courses. And then we talked about it and hashed out ideas and ways that I could approach it in my course. And just having that ability to discuss those ideas with colleagues is incredibly helpful to just get some of the logistics, to hash it out and think about how could this possibly work for my course. I don't really agree with this methodology, but I like the underlying principle. How can I make it work? It didn't just come from me. I think those kinds of learning communities are incredibly important for developing new pedagogical and assessment methods.
It totally makes sense too, right? Because you're teaching collaborative learning.
Absolutely. This came out of a collaborative collaborative meeting for sure.
It's wonderful. That's how and then if you realize that helps you learn, you can also translate that into your students' learning and helping them.
Absolutely.
So thanks so much, Laura.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Yeah, this was great. I've learned a lot, and I hope that our listeners appreciate all of the information you've shared with us today. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Please subscribe to Teach, Learn, Share and let others know about it. Watch out for our next episode. Until next time.